Okay, so welcome everybody. So we still let some people in. This is the second lecture of week 12. And yesterday we talked a lot about urban built environments. So naturally today we have to talk about the other side of the coin, the rural and remote built environments. So that's today's main topic. So we spent a lot of time talking about these sort of pros and cons about urban built environments, what some of their impacts on health could be. So today I want to start off the lecture by asking you guys, what do you think are healthy features of the built environment, specifically in rural settings? And I put North American because I do think most of us are probably more familiar with the North American context, certainly here in Canada, similarly, maybe in the States. So what do you guys think? What are healthy features of the built environment in rural settings? So Savannah says less congestion and pollution. Lots of green space, says Cassandra. Any others? Whoops, I got a call there. Anyone else? Any healthy features of the rural environment, rural built environment? So he says sidewalks that promote walking. Okay, we'll get to that. Homes with lots of space. Yeah. So I think a lot of you are touching on kind of the low density, the vastness of a lot of rural settings, green space certainly. So let's take a look at some of these. So yeah, you guys mentioned green space, access to trails, protected parks is a pretty big perk. Generally, in more rural settings, people do have greater access to things like trails and parks like national parks, provincial parks. Now, these protected parks are not only great for health, but they are also really good for the economy. So in a way that does kind of spur health spending. As we know, we do need money in order to fund things like provincial healthcare systems. And so the more visitors that you're able to attract to some of these parks, the more revenue that they're able to generate and use that money towards things like health. So that's another sort of aspect. And just to kind of talk about how much potential money, well, I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with Alberta being this sort of beautiful province with all these Rocky Mountain national parks. If any of you have been lucky to visit Jasper or Banff or anything like that, then yeah, you would know that a lot of these parks are filled with lots of tourists who are able to spend money, not just international tourists, but certainly within Canada, people tend to flock to a lot of these national parks and do generate a lot of revenue for provinces like that. And to a less extent, some other provinces like here in Ontario, where many of us are based. Now, some other interesting kind of rural urban differences I did want to discuss was this idea that maybe an idealistic idea that in rural settings, children are usually able to be afforded certain freedoms from their parents because there is this general sense of safety and people sort of knowing one another in many rural settings. And so studies have actually kind of looked into this idea of mobility licenses. So mobility licenses is basically how much a parent is allowing their child to sort of roam freely and do activities independently without parental or adult supervision. So yeah, children in less dense, kind of less urbanized areas do tend to be granted more of that mobility licensing from their parents. This is, of course, because of a strong sense of community, self-policing, and surveillance, this general perception that people are looking out for one another in rural settings where many of them are familiar with one another. And this is really important for psychosocial and physical health because, of course, you do want children to learn how to play independently, how to conduct activities independently. Certainly, it can build some trust between community members if they know that, okay, maybe I'll look over the neighborhood this week. Hey, maybe you could kind of take over duties next week and just make sure that the kids in the neighborhood are playing safely, things like that. But also traffic fears tend to be a little bit lower in more rural areas compared to urban, just because the flow of things like congestion, traffic does tend to be lower. And so how does this play out? Well, this study looked at a city and a rural area in Portugal specifically. And so they were looking at what the parents in these various areas let their children do, depending on the community, how urbanized it was. And so generally they did see that the parents from more non-urbanized settings did tend to let their child participate in many more of these different types of activities, whether they were primary school children as well as secondary school children. So just allowing their kids to have kind of more of that freedom, that license to do things more independently. Now, this does tie into community safety and well-being because it's not just parents who perceive issues around community safety differently in rural versus urban contexts. Children do also tend to sort of experience these feelings of community safety in different geographic contexts. So children in rural areas do tend to report higher levels of community trust and safety in their community, their neighborhood, compared to children in urban areas. Why do you guys think that might be? How would a child kind of notice these differences or these perceptions in community safety? So, okay, Zoe says stranger danger. Yeah. Why might there be different perceptions of safety? Any other ideas? Children may know more people in their neighborhood in rural settings. If parents remind their kids that they need to be more careful, the kids will know that they can't trust their communities. Yeah. So maybe some of their kind of parental paranoia might be trickling down. Yeah. Any other ideas? So Esme says, people looking out for one another in rural areas. Yeah, exactly. So a lot of the same kind of things do apply from the parent's perspective as well as to the child's perspective. Just sort of knowing their fellow community members a little bit more might lead to some of that better community trust. Now, this does play a role in childhood health. So a lot of these perceptions of safety have actually been studied and linked to self-reported well-being. So it's not just that children are feeling safer, but because of those feelings of security in their community, they tend to have or experience better well-being, better health, certainly better mental health, because maybe they're not as stressed from their external environment, from potential stressors that way. Now, what are some unhealthy features of the built environment in rural settings? What do you guys think? So Lamisa says far from services. Accessibility, no sidewalks. Further from hospitals. Roads nearby with dangerous speeds. Yeah, these are all great ideas. More isolated communities might have difficulty accessing good food. Yeah, and we will actually talk about food insecurity at the end of today's lecture. So great to highlight that. Yeah, so again, let's take a look at some of these. So some of you mentioned these sort of further distances from services, and yeah, essentially the further you are in a rural setting from services, but also from jobs, the more you're probably going to have to face the potential for longer commutes. So we do know that a lot of jobs and offices and industries can be a pretty considerable distance away from more of those sort of rural and suburban areas. They do tend to be kind of focused in the urbanized centers. And so I thought this was an interesting actual figure to kind of show the commuting patterns, just how much they're centered around the GTA here in Ontario, but also to a lesser extent to some other cities scattered throughout the province. Now, this is important because, of course, the longer you spend commuting, the more that that impacts your time that you can spend on other activities, whether that's activities that are leisurely or quality time spent with your family. And so again, this has been studied on in terms of the impacts on mental health as well as relationships. So personal relationships between people who face longer commutes, for example. And so what some of that research has found is that separation rates between couples do actually tend to be higher among couples where one partner was commuting significant distances compared to couples that both are not commuters. So that does kind of tie into this, the more time that you're spending on the road or commuting to your job or to other places, the less time you have to spend with your significant other, with your family. And so this does really tend to exacerbate a lot of psychosocial interactions or issues in terms of any relationships. And so the rates of separation do tend to be higher. Now, someone also mentioned the lack of services, so the lack of amenities. This is definitely an important characteristic of rural settings, particularly if we're talking about things like health services. So we do know that many important amenities specifically related to health are not within walking distance, for example, in rural areas. So that again does tie into some issues around mobility and access, particularly for those who maybe don't have regular, consistent access to a private vehicle. So how does this actually play out? Well, it turns out here in Canada, 80% of residents in rural areas do not live within walking distance to a pharmacy. Now we know that pharmacies are very important in terms of the access to things like prescription medicine in order to maintain a level of health or to treat many conditions as well. So access to pharmacy is kind of this important indicator for what kind of levels of accessibility to even other health services might exist in a community. Now, we do know also that the rural residents, particularly in the Atlantic and the Maritime provinces, are those that tend to experience the greatest lack of access to a lot of these types of health services. And this is largely due to the fact that a larger proportion of the populations in these Atlantic Maritime provinces do tend to be rural compared to urban, compared to other provinces, I should say. Worth noting is that Ontario and British Columbia do have the highest share of their urban populations. So within the people who are living in urban centers, they have the greatest access to pharmacies out of any province in Canada. So Savannah says, what distance is walking distance, just out of curiosity? That's a good question. So it does depend on the study. Some people define it as 5 minutes, some people define it as 10, others say 5 to 10 minutes. So it does kind of depend. Other studies also do look at it from the perspective of distance. So I know I've seen some research looking at it from, I think, 500 meters or less, defining that as walking distance. Other people saying 1 kilometer. So yeah, unfortunately, there's not really a whole lot of consistent literature, but I do know that this particular report from the federal government did define it as distance of 1 kilometer, which you can see down here. So access to many of these kinds of health amenities we do know is impacted based on the rurality, based on the density of the population, and therefore the density of a lot of these types of outlets, whether it's for health or for food or other amenities. Now, because we know that accessibility to many of these amenities is an issue, perhaps it's a bit of a no-brainer that car dependence does tend to be much more high in rural settings, suburban settings compared to urban areas. So the result of all of this from the perspective of long commutes and poor access to amenities does mean that there is a greater reliance on cars. Now, this is kind of exacerbated by the fact that, as some of you pointed out, the issue of sidewalks in rural settings or suburban settings. So there's not always pedestrian-friendly streets that are built in many of these types of communities. So it is often difficult or even unsafe to travel by any other means of transport other than a car. Certainly, you wouldn't want to necessarily walk a long distance along a country road that maybe does have a pretty high speed limit. That wouldn't necessarily be safe, particularly if there's no sidewalk or pedestrian infrastructure. So this does, in fact, impact people's decision-making in terms of what kind of mode of transport that they'll choose, certainly based on the distance, but also based on that perceived safety and whether or not it is a good choice for them to, let's say, walk to a store that might be a couple of kilometers away compared to in an urban environment where you may only have to walk around the corner to go access something like a store. So there are these differences. Now, how does that play out? As you can see in this sort of figure here, this is looking at specifically the kind of Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. And so these researchers plotted the car ownership rates as well as the population density. And as you can see, it's a pretty good fit. So the more densely populated areas, certainly around the GTA here, do tend to be ones where car dependence rates are the lowest. And then contrastly, the sort of outer limits of the GTA, as you get into those more rural and suburban areas, the higher the car ownership rates do tend to be. Thanks, Regina. Have a good day.
Bye, you too.
Now, another issue I want to raise is rural social isolation. We talked a little bit how urban built environments yesterday can really kind of help build a lot of social interactions between people, specifically among people who would maybe never receive the opportunity to interact with one another in places like public squares. But a lot of that type of built environment infrastructure just doesn't really exist in the rural context. So there is a significant issue in a lot of these rural communities on how to really bring people together and bring different people from different walks of life, different age groups to even interact with one another. So this is particularly an issue with those, again, with any mobility issues, those without a car. How do you get people to have that sense of community and to really build those interactions between people if they can't necessarily travel several kilometers in order to access their local cafe or their local community center? Now, the built environment can be adjusted to decrease this isolation, but that does require some policy and planning. So what do you guys think? What are some ideas for how the built environment in these rural settings could be adjusted to really increase social interactions between people, specifically even among those who maybe don't have a car or who don't have steady access to a car? Any ideas for opportunities to bring social interactions or people together in rural contexts? Or if you even know of any urban initiatives, do you think they would work in the rural context? If not, how come? So what could we do to actually bring these? So Lamisa says festivals. Yeah, so festivals, big community events, whether they're related to music or food or culture, things like that. Sarah says providing some public transit. Cassandra says community centers. Any other ideas? Neighborhood watches. Okay. So that could certainly improve the perceptions of kind of community safety and community ties. So I think we mentioned even in last week's lecture about kind of rural healthcare services. Yeah, so one way to tackle certainly the access issue would be to maybe provide some public transit infrastructure, even something like a shuttle bus or something like that would be helpful. So Sarah, I know you mentioned public transit, which is always good. Increasingly, communities are also looking at ways to plan these types of social enterprise activities, is what they call them. So these activities include things like walking groups, arts and crafts classes, book clubs, things like that, to just try to bring people together in a shared space and maybe share some ideas, share some perspectives, get that social interaction between different people. And so this is being launched increasingly in a lot of rural communities alongside any sort of seniors programs to really make sure that seniors are particularly not ones to be sort of left behind or isolated in these types of rural communities where generally a greater proportion of seniors do tend to live compared to urban environments. And so these are great ways to just encourage meetups and opportunities to get that interaction between different people, particularly among seniors, newcomers, but anybody who's living in a community that maybe doesn't have that strong infrastructure in place to really encourage these types of meetups or interactions between different people. And yeah, a lot of these are launched here in Canada. I know I came across some studies while doing research around this in the UK, and there are some interesting initiatives actually around also bringing old buses to come into service and sort of participate in these spaces to transport people from one activity to another to kind of create this whole program or this plan to get people to interact over the course of a whole day's activity. Now, who decides whether a building gets built in a given area? So we talked a little bit about this yesterday in the context of urban planning. Does anyone remember what we said or who we decided kind of had responsibility over a lot of these issues? So who are the kind of important decision makers that we would want to get in touch with if we wanted to build a building or plan some sort of infrastructure? So Lamisa says municipal government, Nicole says municipal government. Any other ideas? So Zoe says planners, architects, probably the municipality would give approval. Urban planners and civil engineers. Yeah, so we did a little bit talk about this yesterday in the context of how many players or stakeholders do you have to be involved anytime you're planning something like, let's say, a new community. But yeah, you guys are right to point out that the community sometimes as well. Yeah, so that's also a great point, Cassandra. Hopefully the community has some sort of input in any sort of building or infrastructure, but unfortunately the opportunities to have community input aren't always the best. So let's talk a little bit about the municipal government, as many of you did identify that as a very important stakeholder. So responsibilities around land use and any sort of plans between rural as well as urban areas do tend to necessitate the approval or the final say based on the municipality or the municipal government. And this is certainly true in the urban context, right, where you generally have a pretty well-organized municipality. The municipal government is really kind of its own level of government that is an important stakeholder. But in many other places, let's say here in Ontario, that might not always be true. So in places like Northern Ontario, these communities are often multiple sort of towns or townships that are all linked into one general region. So there's not really this sense of a one tier municipality in the way that many of us are familiar with, maybe if we're from the GTA or other places, other cities in Ontario. So in the context of these rural settings, often these approvals have to be done by a sort of planning board, and these boards might be representatives from different municipalities, different towns or townships in an entire region. Sometimes these are appointed by a local municipal council. Other times, in particularly remote areas of the province, it's actually the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, so someone from the provincial government that kind of has to step in and provide the final say around any sort of development or any sort of project. So we've got this sort of mishmash of different ways to provide something like a building permit or approval to build any sort of community infrastructure, or let's say we were talking about a community center, for example. So this means that different people, different organizations have different levels of responsibility depending on whether you live in a rural versus urban context here in Ontario. So with all of these sort of different ways of getting a final say on whether you can build something, how might these types of arrangements impact the level of consultation and input from local communities? What do you guys think? Particularly in somewhere like a rural or remote community, let's say here in Ontario, where they're not even necessarily voting for a municipal councillor to be their voice on a planning committee. Maybe it's more so kind of given by the final say from the minister, the provincial minister of municipal affairs. So how might that impact the level of consultation? So Savannah says the community would have less say in remote regions for planning. Do you think there would be opportunities for consultation in these types of settings, or how might it look differently compared to, let's say, in urban communities? So Cassandra says surveys. Do you mean that surveys would maybe have to be launched to adequately make sure that you have people's kind of input or consultation? Yep. What about accountability? So if people are not necessarily voted in order to represent the interests of local community members, how do you guys think that might impact something like accountability from that perspective? So let's say we wanted to build a big mine, for example, in a remote part of Ontario, a sparsely populated part of Ontario. What if something goes wrong at the mine? Kind of whose accountability would it be? Whose jurisdiction would that be? So Christiga says if issues arise, it might be more difficult to address them. Yeah, I mean, you can't just vote out a counselor that you're not happy with, right? Because if there's no one that you voted for that's the one who's responsible for these decisions, then your ability to kind of hold them to account and make sure that your interests are being represented is very limited from that perspective, right? If it's some other bureaucrat, let's say from the provincial government, that's kind of making the decisions around that community, that does kind of have an impact on what level of input, what level of consultation might be required. So Cassandra says, would the province assume responsibility if anything happened? So I'm assuming this is in regards to the mining example. That does depend. If it was, for example, on Crown land, so on provincial government land, then yes. If it was on land that, let's say, an industry had bought up, then technically it would be the industry's responsibility to try to address this, along with potentially the Ministry of Environment, if there was, let's say, an environmental catastrophe that happened. But hopefully this kind of illustrates the issues around many of these remote communities, and particularly remote communities as we see them as sparsely populated. You know, there are still many times Indigenous communities or First Nations reserves that are in close proximity to a lot of these remote places where a lot of development, industry development does tend to happen. So it's an interesting kind of delegation of responsibilities in many of these types of infrastructure projects, particularly in rural and remote settings like Northern Ontario, where the local government plays less of a role because there's too many little towns and townships to be able to kind of formally organize in a municipality that would have that kind of power or that kind of say. And so this does have an impact on what level of input, what level of even communication someone in a local community might be able to offer in regards to any kind of big infrastructure projects like that. So it does get a little bit complicated from the rural perspective. I think many of us are used to dealing with these types of issues or hearing about these types of issues from a more urban or suburban context, but it does get quite a bit more complicated from a rural community standpoint. Now, can we change the existing built environment in urban and suburban rural areas? So now that we've kind of highlighted some of these shortcomings or the issues with many of these types of environments, well, Jane Jacobs thought so. And Jane Jacobs was kind of an important person in the movement around new urbanism, urban planning. And so she was not originally kind of a scholar on this kind of thing. She kind of came to the field from a more community activist role. But in the 1960s, she started to publish a lot of books around these issues around urban communities, urban decay, certainly, and what she saw, given that she was living in New York City, as issues around things like gentrification and things like that. So in 1962, she published The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and this really condemned the sort of general approaches to urban planning at that time. And at that time, remember, this is sort of post-World War II, urban planning in North America was really obsessed with this idea of the suburbs and cars. And so increasingly, this was leading to a lot of disinvestment from urban cities, urban cores, and moving a lot of that emphasis on planning communities and planning amenities and things like that more towards suburban communities. So a lot of the work that she did inspired this sort of wave of what we call new urbanism. And new urbanism is just kind of a perspective of urban planning that aims to reintroduce a lot of higher density or medium density and mixed use zoning in urban planning, in many ways to kind of mirror the European city streetscapes and try to bring that more to the North American context. Now, something else that Jane Jacobs was kind of famous for saying was this concept of eyes on the street. And so according to her, the whole reason why we should have these sort of medium density communities with more mixed use zoning was to just have more people invited to interact on the street, and how that could actually lead to increased safety or perceptions of safety on the street, because the more eyes you have on the street, the more that that provides this sort of informal level of kind of surveillance with neighbors checking up on each other, knowing who lives in their community and being able to interact with one another, really instituting some of that community trust among individuals. Now, public health officials and planners have also used many of these principles of new urbanism to advocate for some of these health promoting neighborhood designs. So, whether that's something like trying to initiate more patios or cafes to open on a streetscape, closing certain lanes of traffic in order to open more perhaps public seating in a particular street. These are many kind of initiatives that originally would have been touted as important from the perspective of new urbanism. So that's kind of where all of these things came from. And just to sort of illustrate what I mean by that, this is a kind of typical street from Copenhagen, so in Denmark. And just very typical of this kind of new urbanism design is to really introduce things like this medium density, cafes and streets, and people sort of interacting with one another in the street, traffic calming measures to make sure that cars are kind of secondary towards pedestrian or bicycle use. Now, this brings us to today's case study that I wanted to talk about. So we've talked about the rural and built environment a little bit along Canada's First Nations and Indigenous populations, certainly some of the issues that they face related to healthcare access. But I do want to talk about an important aspect of that, and that's food access, food insecurity, because access to amenities like grocery stores is also extremely important from the perspective of health promotion compared to, let's say, something like access to a hospital. So both of these are very, very important to kind of highlight. Now, what is food insecurity for those of us who are maybe a little bit unfamiliar with this term? So food insecurity is defined as the disruption of food intake or eating patterns because of either a lack of money or a lack of resources. Now, as we know, access to fresh and healthy food really is essential for good health. We saw in previous lectures from this course just how important nutrition is with respect to things like combating infectious diseases as well as chronic diseases. So we know that really staying healthy in many ways does start with access to fresh and healthy, nutritious food. Now, food insecurity happens often due to a lack of affordability or a lack of access. And maybe some of you are familiar with the term of food deserts. So food deserts being areas where there's a lack of access to healthy food due to specifically how the built environment was arranged. So for example, due to a limited number of grocery stores, that would result in something that we call a food desert. So food deserts can actually cause food insecurity. So that's kind of how these two concepts are linked. And we have a question. In the previous slide, why would Ontario opt out of the food insecurity measurement? That is a great question. Oops. Go back. So this survey does come out pretty frequently. In some iterations, other provinces have decided to kind of do their own survey. So that might be why Ontario decided to opt out. I'm actually not 100% familiar with the particular reason for this year's Canadian Health Survey. But at times it can be because the province has decided that they've done their own sort of equivalent survey, so they might not necessarily participate. Other times, provinces are a little bit slow to actually provide this data to federal surveys, and so that might be another reason why this happens, but that's a good question. So I do want to highlight this particular issue related to Northern Indigenous communities, specifically Inuit. So in 2018, one of the only 2 grocery stores in Iqaluit, which is the capital of Nunavut, caught fire. Now, people were extremely concerned when this happened because, of course, that only left the community with one viable grocery store operating for a community of about, gosh, I'm forgetting the population of Iqaluit. I think it's around 40,000. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. So that entire community was left with one grocery store. Now, I should say, luckily, the second grocery store was able to reopen, but really this kind of brought the issue to the forefront of how a small city can operate with only 2 grocery stores, and 2 grocery stores that are usually pretty unaffordable. So this does impact food insecurity in places like this that are already dealing with issues around affordability. So let's talk about that affordability issue. The cost of groceries is extremely high. So a third of Inuit surveyed actually found that they have to eat less because of issues around affordability. So let's just take a look at what this would mean. So the Canadian average, if you can see in these little figures, is the sort of pinkish red line. And for various types of groceries or food items that you would find, these are the prices in different communities in Nunavut. So as you can see, they're significantly higher than the Canadian average in that sort of pink line. Now, rates of obesity and diabetes are also much higher compared to the general population. And so this might seem like a bit of a strange consequence of the fact that there is food insecurity or issues around food affordability. So why might this be? Why might these communities be both facing something like a food shortage from that perspective of affordability, but also dealing with issues related to things like diabetes and obesity, which are traditionally thought of as health issues related to too much food? So Cassandra says cheap foods are often unhealthy. Yeah. The lack of access to fresh foods, so they have to increase their intake of junk foods. Exactly. And in the Northern Canadian communities, we know that there was typically a very kind of traditional diet, a diet of primarily kind of meats that they hunted in the north. Savannah says it's hard to transport fresh foods to Northern communities. Yeah, exactly. So already, the typical diet wasn't necessarily centered around a lot of fruit or vegetable intake. And this is, if anything, only become exacerbated because not only do you have issues now around limits towards hunting and being able to access these types of traditional foods, but also things like environmental reasons, so issues with drinking water contamination and environmental pollution. These have increasingly led to people sort of abandoning many of these traditional hunting practices, moving away from those traditional foods, and perhaps embracing more of these types of processed or cheaper foods that do tend to be higher in fat and processed sugar and things like that. Now, luckily, there have been some initiatives lately to try to address some of these issues around food insecurity, so food affordability and access. So there are some agricultural initiatives, something like the Iqaluit Community Greenhouse Society, which actually built a greenhouse in Iqaluit to try to address some of these shortages in things like fresh fruits and vegetables from a kind of micro perspective. There's also some initiatives to try and encourage more safe hunting and consumption of traditional foods again, to try to inspire especially the sort of younger generation of Inuit to really take up the practices again. There's also the Nutrition North program, which is a subsidy for nutritious food and some essential food items, such as diapers or other kind of important health items. But what else could be done? What do you guys think? Are there any other initiatives that you think they're missing that could address some of these issues around food insecurity? So if you were the mayor of Iqaluit, let's say, what would you try to do to address some of these issues around food insecurity? So Cassandra says, I saw something about gardens being maintained in shipping containers that are self-powered with solar panels located on the ground so they can be cleared off. That's a really interesting initiative. Yeah, so maybe that's something that could be explored. I do know there has been actually a push to try to increase the number of solar farms in the north, considering they have, entire days of sun and long hours of daylight during some seasons. So that might be particularly helpful. Any other ideas for what could be done? A company called The Grocer helps with food insecurity. It uses hydroponic containers to grow food in cold environments. Yeah, so that's another great kind of technological initiative that could be used. Are there any community initiatives that you guys think might be helpful? Maybe like a food sharing program. Yeah, that's a good idea, Sarah. Any others? There are, for example, also some initiatives to try to teach people gardening skills, given the limited sort of growing season, to try to even just foster that love of kind of growing your own food and taking some kind of, um, enjoyment from trying to tackle these issues around food insecurity. So there have been initiatives for that. If there's any others. Okay. So this brings us to the end of today's lecture. And for anyone that maybe took a look on the announcement that I posted yesterday on Avenue, in case some of you are still following what's going on Avenue these days. So for the remaining kind of 5 minutes of today, I'll talk a little bit about the final exam, and I'll ask for your guys' input about the final exam. And I do want to highlight that in next week's lecture, so the final 2 lectures of the semester, where we'll talk about workplace and health, I do want to just bring up that we will have a guest lecture for the last lecture of the term. So that's next Wednesday, a week from today. And so hopefully many of you will attend that, and we'll kind of end that lecture as well with a bit of a course wrap up and answer any questions about the final exam so that we all know what's happening there. So when is the final exam? Well, it's in exactly 1 month. So we have a pretty late exam day. It's on Wednesday, April 28th at 4 p.m. Where will it be? It will be online, as I'm sure many of you have kind of clued into that. I decided not to have any sort of kind of formal proctored exam. I just don't really think it's all that useful. If you guys really wanted to cheat, you could. I'm not sure cheating on an exam will be particularly helpful for an exam like this, where I think it's not really in your best interest to try to memorize any content. The exam questions will be much more kind of application based, just to see if you are able to kind of use some of the concepts or things that we've talked about over the course of the course, and whether or not you're able to apply them to the questions that will be asked. So how it will work is that I will post a link to a Google Docs that you guys will just upload from that link. It'll be an announcement on Avenue, and you guys will download that, type in your responses directly into the document, and then submit that Word document back onto Avenue as kind of an assignment, as you guys have been doing throughout this term. Technically, you guys have 2.5 hours, 2.5 hours to do that. That's kind of the scheduled exam time. But I think I will allow you to kind of keep uploading it for perhaps another 30 minutes to an hour. I haven't quite decided yet, depending on the length of the exam. So hopefully there won't be any reason for you to feel really time crunched to write the exam. I definitely want to make sure that you have enough time to provide thoughtful responses and not feel rushed. Now, here's the fun part. I haven't finished making the exam, so might as well help me decide what should be on it. So it is cumulative. There are going to be questions and things related to the beginning of the term as well as the end of the term, but that's a whole lot of content. So if you guys want to help me narrow down what should or should not be on it, I've actually made a Google survey for you to provide some input. So I'm going to copy and paste this link, and I'll put it in the chat, and you guys can save it there. So maybe I'll stop sharing my screen. Okay, here we go. So I just asked a few questions in the survey about what are some things that you liked learning about, what would you want to see on an exam, what are some things that you didn't like learning about, what would you not want to see on the exam. And it is anonymous, so feel free to be as honest as you want to be. If you want to provide any specific feedback or concerns about your particular circumstances, feel free to provide your name in one of the forms and let me know, hey, this is something I'm worried about for the exam. But by all means, you can fill it out anonymously and let me know what you think should be a part of it or shouldn't be a part of it. So are there any questions about the exam right off the bat? If not, then that's all that we've got prepared for today. So you're free to go.